and paper. And mostly paper that I make myself. In my work, as Jamie said, I explore themes of spirituality within the framework of my own religious upbringing and my connection to my Korean heritage. And my approach is largely formed and influenced by my studies at the University of Iowa Center for the Book, and also the research that I did in Korea. And I should add too that even though this is an artist talk, I will be spending some time talking about Korean papermaking and its history, and a little show and tell after the talk and show some paper artifacts. I'm drawn to the tradition, repetition, and ritual of religious services, and translate this sense of devotion to a visual language using cut paper, sewing, drawing, printing, papermaking, and weaving. And the things I make are often a reflection of the spiritual questions that I'm grappling with internally. I'm drawn to the materiality and physicality of books, the way their reading can be intimate and holistic, like a religious experience. Growing up in the evangelical church, and then largely growing disillusioned with the church as an adult, I use my artwork as a vehicle for exploration and asking questions. And these are just some representative images of my earlier book work. Paper is such a rich material that has so many possibilities and ways to infuse meaning, not only in the process of making, but also in the way that meaning and metaphor can literally be embedded in its layers. For this series, I used printing, weaving, writing, and sumi ink to embed images into the paper. And these are made of gampi. This is another piece from the same invocation series. This one is Cozo paper. You can see here the repetitive religious text written like an invocation. And it's hard to see in this picture, but the circle image is actually embedded between two very thin layers of Cozo. Paper is a transformative and versatile material that can be manipulated, felt, spun, twined, even woven into cloth. And I'm very process oriented, so this image of cut paper is very exciting to me because this is the moment in strips of textile. And while I was at Iowa, I started spinning paper thread, using it in my book work. And in that process, I learned a lot about the unique characteristics of Asian paper, specifically Japanese and Korean paper, which is traditionally made out of strong bast fibers like Cozo or gampi or Mitsumata. While I was at Iowa, I gained a pretty strong grasp of Japanese papermaking because my professor had spent time studying in Japan. And this is me forming a sheet of washi using a mix of gampi and Cozo fibers. That's gampi on the top left. And I had learned about Korean papermaking briefly during the lecture, but the vast majority of the focus of our program was on Western or Japanese style papermaking and their related histories. And in my experience, most printmakers and artists and even just people in general knew way more about Western art than Asian art. And then even among East Asia compared to Japan and China, Korea is often neglected or overlooked. So to be honest, I think this sort of underdog mentality is what was driving me in my quest to learn more about Korean papermaking, even though at that time I did not take a very strong personal interest in my own Korean heritage. So I applied for some funding, and the summer before my last year of grad school, I traveled to Korea on a research grant, specifically to explore this connection between papermaking and spirituality. And I was particularly interested in this connection after learning about how the transmission of papermaking and Buddhism was so closely linked in East Asia. Paper was invented in China in 105 AD, or probably even before then, and then spread from China to Japan via Korea in the 7th century. And in both Japan and Korea, the availability of paper allowed for the transcription of Buddhist scriptures, which were published in large numbers in the 7th century using woodblock printing as the primary technology. So I was intrigued by this connection, and I wanted to visit some of the places in Korea that were historically and spiritually significant, such as this Buddhist temple called Haeinsa. I spent several nights at Haeinsa, which is known for housing the entire Buddhist canon, carved by hand onto over 80,000 wooden printing blocks. And the original wood blocks were carved in the 11th century, but were destroyed by fire during the Mongol invasion. And then they were recarved in the 13th century, and they're now housed in this specially constructed depository at the temple. So Korea had been making books and paper for centuries prior to and uninfluenced by the Western world. That summer, I also visited Cheongju, which is home of Hungdok Temple, where the oldest existing book printed with movable metal type was published. And this Buddhist document is known as Chikji. It was published in 1377, which predated Gutenberg's Bible by 78 years. And I had never heard before that Koreans had invented movable metal type, even though I had taken a number of classes on letterpress printing. That summer, I also spent a week with a papermaker, artist, and Buddhist nun named Yeongdam Sunim. She used to be a production papermaker. Now she lives in the countryside and makes artwork with Hanji. And this is Yeongdam Sunim and me mixing up a vat in preparation for papermaking. Yeongdam Sunim was the first person who taught me how to make Hanji. And from her, I learned a lot about the spiritual and material qualities of Hanji. During this trip, I also looked at many examples of Korean books and artifacts, including this map of Korea. This is a very famous map. It's called the Grand Map of Korea, or the Daedongyo Jido. It's a woodblock printed map created by Kim Jong-ho in 1861. And it was printed on 22 long sheets folded accordion style. Based on his travels throughout Korea on foot, Kim carved his designs on both sides of 60 wood blocks, which were then used to print each piece of the map on paper. And in a time when knowledge was reserved for the privileged, sort of educated classes, Kim's goal was to make all knowledge of Korea's territory accessible for everyone. After I came back from that summer in Korea, I decided to make my thesis project using the same structure as the Grand Map of Korea. The title of this work is Via Negativa, which is Latin for the negative way. It's made up of 21 accordion books that are housed in a box, but when they're opened up and arranged in order, they form a larger image. And each book contains collage, letterpress printing, sumi and walnut ink wash, and cutouts. I could sense then and can see now how my understanding and experience of faith was shifting, even as I began to embrace my connection to the history and traditions of my Korean ancestors. And I had just spent all this time at Buddhist temples and had learned how to make Korean paper with a Buddhist nun. At the same time, I was starting to explore ancient Christian texts written by early mystics who wrote about this idea of the negative way, this great cloud of unknowing, which are actually very Buddhist ideas as well. So this work sort of encapsulates the moment that I began to embrace a more Eastern and Buddhist framework and start to move away from a Protestant Reformed understanding of religion and spirituality. So after I graduated from Iowa, I returned to Korea to continue my research in Korean printing and papermaking, this time on a Fulbright. And one of my biggest goals for that year was to deepen my understanding and practice in making Hanji. And I'm going to switch gears for a moment and just talk a bit about the history and characteristics of Hanji. And Hanji literally means the paper of Korea. So I already mentioned how papermaking in Korea has a long history, over 1,600 years old. Koreans developed their own indigenous method of sheet forming, distinct from China and Japan. There's a famous Korean proverb that silk lasts 500 years while paper lasts 1,000. And for many centuries, the quality of Hanji was recognized by other nations. It was considered an indispensable export item to China. And Hanji was closely intertwined in the daily lives of Koreans. It was used for windows, doors, flooring, important religious and government documents, books, of course, crafts, furniture, even suits of armor. For a while, hundreds of mills actively made paper and were supported by the government. But by the end of the 19th century, the Hanji industry showed a rapid decline with the importation of Western machine-made paper. During the Japanese occupation of Korea during the first half of the 20th century, indigenous Korean papermaking techniques were replaced by Japanese methods, such that now the traditional method of making Hanji is nearly extinct. Paper production became more industrialized, chemical agents were introduced during the processing of fibers, and machines replaced human hands. So now there's only 22 hand paper mills that remain in Korea, and most of them make paper the Japanese way. In Korea, paper is traditionally made by hand, one sheet at a time. They say it takes 100 steps to make a single sheet of Hanji, from harvesting the mulberry trees, stripping the bark, scraping and cooking, cleaning, beating, and then finally forming the sheets, which are then pressed, parted, and dried. This image is of a freshly formed sheet of paper, and this image was taken at Jangjibang Hanji Mill, where I had the opportunity to work as an apprentice for a month in 2016. Before I got to make paper at the vat, I had to process the fiber, and I spent an entire week just scraping bark. I worked with this elderly woman to scrape the bark, and she's seen here outside of her house, hanging bark on a line to dry. These older Korean ladies, these ajumma, they worked at the mill 6 days a week. And their only job was to pick the cooked fiber clean in preparation for paper making. This step is necessary if you want to have a white, clean sheet of paper without impurities. And this is especially important for printmakers and artists, calligraphers, conservators. The only other way to make a piece of paper white and clean is to chemically bleach the paper. I'm gonna see if I can show this little video. Let's see here. So just to give a sense of the sheet forming process, I wanted to show a short video of my teacher demonstrating how to do weba sheet forming, which is the oldest traditional method in Korea. So another name for this method is hullimtugi, which translates to flowing or spilling over. There's no frame. The paper is scooped up and then moves from side to side. It's almost like the fibers are being woven together in multiple directions, resulting in a sheet that does not have a prominent grain direction. And each sheet is actually 2-ply. So the side closest to the paper maker tends to gather more fiber. And so to even it out, the paper maker couches the second sheet upside down. And so for this reason, Hanji is often called moon sun paper or yin yang paper in Korean. This is me and my teacher and his mother and the 3 ajummas on my last day at the mill. I really respect my teacher, as his is one of the few mills committed to carrying on the tradition of making traditional Korean paper using local materials and without chemicals. And I like to show this photo because I think it's really important to ask ourselves and ask myself how to support these traditional crafts, which are often family run, require a slower pace of life and appreciation for handwork and quality materials. And people often balk at the cost of high quality paper, handmade paper. But the reason these are expensive is because without support from the government, this is truly the cost of producing these goods. And it is backbreaking, very slow and intense labor. So I left the mill with a determination to keep using Hanji in my own work and to educate people about Korean books and paper. To that end, when I came back to the States, my friend Lars Kim and I organized this portfolio project called Hanji Edition. We selected 5 print artists and had them produce an edition of 20 prints using Hanji from Jeongjibang. And we produced the first portfolio in 2018 and are currently working on the second portfolio with a new group of artists. And our intention for this project is to educate and promote the use of Hanji in fine art applications. Another project that I worked on during my Fulbright was a historical survey of Korean bookbinding structures. And these are some of the book models that I made while interning at a conservation lab. And I'm particularly interested in the distinctly Korean book covers, which are burnished and waxed with a patterned woodblock, which brings out a subtle design. And so I was able to acquire 2 carved woodblocks for embossing covers, and I used them to teach workshops on traditional Korean bookmaking. And when I returned from Korea, I brought back a few essential papermaking tools, including a screen and a frame, which is a pal and a tul in Korean. And I hired a local woodworker to build a vat for me based on specs that I got from Amy Lee, who is another Hanji artist, researcher, papermaker. And these are some images of Cozo fiber that were actually harvested in Florida and then processed here in Sacramento and in San Francisco, where I taught my first Hanji workshop. And these are some images of students making and kuching Hanji. I also started to make paper at home, and bringing the process home to my own backyard has allowed me to continue to integrate Korean paper making with the rest of my life, and to continue to find ways to use Hanji in my own work and share about it with others. You can see my daughter peeking out through the window. I'm also actively seeking ways to connect with others in the Korean diaspora who identify as artists and makers, and have recently started a Korean American Artist Collective with the purpose of building solidarity with marginalized communities and people of color. And as I learn more about the complex history of my ancestors, filled with years of oppression and colonization and even continued occupation by the US to this day, I'm compelled to connect with others who share this history and seek ways to build community and work towards liberation. This is a poster for a fundraiser we did for BLM in July. There's a lot more I can say about my Fulbright research year, which I won't go into now, but for those of you who are interested, I kept a research journal while I was in Korea, and the link is at the bottom of this slide. So I'll end by talking about some of my more recent work. While I was in Korea, I kept coming across these Korean wrapping cloths called bojagi. And these are textiles that are pieced together with small scraps of fabric. Historically, bojagi occupied a prominent place in the daily lives of Koreans. They were often used to wrap or carry ritual objects, books, clothes, blankets, letters, gifts, or to cover food. And these were made by women of all classes in a culture of restraint and austerity. So bojagi was a unique form of creative expression. And they came in a variety of colors and sizes and fabrics and designs. And because of their minimalist design, they are often compared to the work of 20th century European artists like Piet Mondrian or Paul Klee. However, I see these bojagis and I think of all the unnamed women who endured a life of hardship and oppression in a patriarchal society. And I think about this concept of jung, which is this very Korean concept that is difficult to translate, but it basically means this Korean traditional love of giving and forgiving, and it encompasses this sense of community and hospitality. So I was moved by the sense of community and hospitality that I experienced in Korea, and that is infused in these wrapping cloths. So I started to learn how to make traditional bojagi for a few months while I was in Korea. And when I came back to the US, I started making bojagi out of Hanji. And these are a couple of the earlier pieces that I made pretty much right after I came back from Korea using Hanji that I had made at Jangjibang. Since being back from Korea, I also gave birth to 2 kids. And my first child, Winnie, is almost a year old in this photo. And she's almost 4 now. And here I'm using persimmon dye to color sheets of Hanji, which are then cut up and pieced back together. In making each bojagi, I feel both a physical and spiritual connection to my time in Korea by the process and material I'm using. I'm grateful that by making things with my hands, I can connect in some way to my heritage. This is another more traditional style bojagi with straps, and it's colored with natural dye and sumi ink. And most of these are constructed, they're pasted together with wheat paste. This is another more recent bojagi that I made using Hanji that I printed on during a parent artist residency at Hala, where Anthea is now. And this one is actually stitched together, which is traditionally how bojagi is made. They're hand stitched. I'm still working out what it means to be an artist and a mom, and what it means to have faith, what it means to be both Korean and American. So there's a lot I'm still working out, but I feel grounded in this slow process of patching bits of handmade paper together piece by piece. And that is my talk. And I'm just gonna put up this slide of contact info. So if anyone has questions later or wants to get in touch, feel free. And I'm gonna stop sharing now.
Thank you, Steph. I really appreciate all of the ways that you're thinking both about sort of your conceptual approach to your making and its ties to your, you know, your ancestry and history and your spirituality. I think that it's and the way that it coalesces through these like totally abstract forms. I really that also are touching in these sort of like utilitarian objects. I really appreciate all that. So I want to open it up for a short Q&A, or Steph, would you rather do your show and tell now?
Either way.
Why don't we do your show and tell first, and then we'll do Q&A.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good. So I'm going to call in on my phone. Let's see if this works.
So I would just say maybe everyone, you're going to want to go into the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen and click on, make sure it's on speaker view, because I'm not sure if, otherwise it'll just be a small square of Steph sharing through her phone.
Can you see this?
It's just blank at the moment.
Okay.
It's as if the camera were off.
Oh, huh. Do you see the other screen with my hand?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. So I'm just gonna, I turned off my other camera and I'm just gonna do a little bit of show and tell. Normally in this sort of talk, I would have this table of artifacts and books, and people could come up and choose what they want to touch and look through, but we can't do that now. So I'm just gonna show you a few things. I know this is, for Jamie, your papermaking class, so I just wanted to briefly share a couple of resources. Let me see here. For anyone who's interested, for anyone who's interested in learning more about East Asian papermaking. Can you all see this? Okay.
Yes.
So this is sort of like the Bible of Japanese papermaking, and for anyone who's interested in learning about how to make Hanji, washi, there's a lot of similarities in the process. Obviously, I talked about some of the differences, like the sheet forming process and things like that, but this is like a really important, good start.
We just lost the image, Steph. Uh-oh.
Oh, sorry about that.
It's okay.
It's because someone just called me. All right, so, and then this is another important book, Hanji Unfurled, for anyone. I mentioned Amy Lee, she, this is her here, but she also went to Korea on a Fulbright, and wrote a whole book about her experience. And this book is Paper and Threshold, which is a book all about the connection between paper and spirituality in Asian cultures. This is by a woman named Dorothy Field. And she traveled all over Asia and kind of documented different instances that she saw of paper being used in these different ways. So this is a really rich book that I would recommend if anyone's interested in that topic. And then finally, I'll just put a pitch for Hand Papermaking Magazine. This is a really great publication. And these are these issues in particular kind of talk about paper as textile, paper in spirituality, paper in Asian cultures. Okay, so I guess I wanted to just show some of the materials. This is the raw fiber. This is Cozo. And again, Cozo is paper mulberry. And then Cozo is the Japanese word and tak is the Korean word. And so like a lot of things, the Japanese word is sort of the accepted or most well-known phrase. You hear Cozo paper a lot. It's the same, it's just the fiber that's the paper is made out of. And so you can see that there's, when it's dry, it kind of curls up like this, but there's actually three layers, the inner white layer, and then this green layer, and then this outer brown layer. So all of this has to be scraped off by hand. It gets soaked and then scraped. And then, so this is what it looks like when it's all scraped clean. And then this is called white bark. This is, so, I mean, if you go to like a paper maker's workshop, which is often also their home, you can see so many examples of paper and fiber and pulp in various stages. And so you'll see this hanging outside, either scraped or not. And then nothing can go to waste, right? This is like really precious material. This is actually a piece of bark that's been stretched out. So when this is wet, it's quite pliable and you can stretch it out to make this almost like a sheet. And I've seen this used as almost like an interior design element. You can also, this is like a little book that I made. This is bark. This is thread made out of just teasing out layers from here. And then this can be used. So all of this material is precious, and paper can be used in so many different ways. I'm also going to show you some examples of thread. So I talked about in my talk about paper thread. These are just some examples of thread made out of various kinds of paper. This is Hanji. Oops. And then this is a piece of, this is called shifu in Japanese. It's a cloth that's woven with paper. It's a little sample. These are some larger samples that I picked up in Japan. And then I talked too about how, oh, here's another example of shifu. This is actually shifu used as this book cloth for making this book. And then I talked about paper, how you can twine it. So this is actually corded Hanji, and this is a whole art form in itself. And then if you can take the cords and you know anything about like basket weaving, this is an art form. This is like a in progress. This one's made by Amy Lee, but traditionally these sort of twined cords of Hanji were used to create these large vessels that were then coated with some form of waterproofing, like kanyaku or persimmon dye or natural lacquer to make it waterproof, and then it can be used like any other sort of vessel. Just another example of that. These are just, I talked about paper as textile. When you crumple Hanji or any sort of Asian paper, when you crumple it enough and agitate it enough, it can turn into almost like a fabric. In Japanese, that's called momigami. In Korean, it's called jumchi. And depending on how much you agitate the finished sheet, you can get really different results. You can even fuse sheets together purely with water in your hands to make these really almost like leather-like sheets. They kind of transform into a different material, but these are just some pouches that I had made for a show. And this is paper, and this is I think this is silk. This is Junji paper, and this is, I think that's rainy. And I wanted to show a couple examples of Hanji that's been printed. This is, this was done by Lars Kim. This was letterpress printed. And then this was woodblock printed. This I picked up in Korea. And just like a quick note about bookmaking in Korea and in Asia in general, you can see that this frame, it sort of denotes the size of the page. And then this here down the middle is sort of like a guide for the bookbinder to know where to fold the page in half. And so traditionally, you know, sometimes people say, why is the paper so thin or sheer? And it's, I mean, paper books traditionally were printed on one side and then folded in half at this fold line like that. I am gonna just quickly show some of the tools. This is like not the best angle, but this is like a small Japanese sugeta that I picked up in Korea. Like I mentioned, most of the paper that's made in Korea now is made using these tools and this method. And so this, you can see how this is a frame that opens up, and then the screen is this flexible bamboo screen. It's different from Western paper making where the screen is not flexible and you kind of have to, there's a different method of transferring the sheet from the screen. And then this is a pal, which is a Korean screen. And it's hard to tell, but this is actually goes vertically and sits on this frame that doesn't have walls. It's kind of just, the screen sort of sits on top. Couple more things I picked up while I was in Korea. I picked up a lot of these like old decomposing books, partially just to get different examples of the binding, but I'm, like I said, I'm really interested in these covers, which normally are, you can't see this side because the end sheet is supposed to stick down onto it. But because these are so old and falling apart, you can kind of see the embossed image, which I think is really beautiful. This is another different pattern. And this one is another one that's a very, this one's it has that lotus pattern. It's a very Buddhist pattern. And then finally, I just wanted to show you this book that there was a slide of it, but this one is another bojagi that I made that's in book form. And this one's all hand stitched. But as a book artist, I really wanted to make a bojagi in this form. And that's it for my show and tell. And I'm totally happy to let me see if I can do this. All right, I'm happy to show anything in particular in more detail or send photos or talk more about anything that was of interest, but I think that's it. Can you hear me? Okay.
Thank you so much, Steph. So I guess I would sort of open it up to questions, and maybe give us a hand raise, or feel free to like type something in the chat if you have a question, and then I can read it to the group. And I will, I hope it's okay with everyone, but I'm recording this video and maybe I'll stop at this point, but I'm gonna figure out along with CCA if there's a place that the videos can be hosted as part of this program. So I'll let everybody know that that's happening. I'll also, for those of you who are my students, I'll provide all of the links and information to stuff that Steph showed us, if people have more interested. So we have a question in the chat, Steph, that says, if time and resources were not an issue, what project would you like to do?
Hi, Mickey. If time and resources were not an issue, I actually really enjoyed, so I shared some of the images from Invocation, the work that I did back in 2014, which were kind of the woven and printed papers that were made, that were embedded. And I didn't show the sort of the process behind making those, but it's actually really, I really enjoy making them because you're kind of creating the image in the middle of making, in the middle of sheet forming. So you couch an image, couch a sheet of paper and then sort of create your image and then couch another sheet on top of that. And I think for me, as someone who's very process oriented, I tend not to really plan a lot in advance. And I would love to try that process again and experiment with that more, in particularly using Hanji, and in that invocation series that was all with Japanese paper, the Japanese sheet forming. So yeah, I think in general, I would love to do more projects using Hanji, and I think it's just very significant for me to be able to do to make paper in that way. Should I answer the next question?
Yeah, Steph, go ahead. If you can see all the chats, just take the lead.
Okay. Of all the materials I've used to make paper, do I have a favorite? I am most familiar with Cozo, which is, like I said, it's paper mulberry. It's compared to some of the other Asian fibers. It's the strongest. It has, it's very, if you look at it under a microscope, the fibers themselves are very long, which makes the paper strong and allows you to do all this manipulation and make all of these things that I just showed you. So I'm most familiar with Cozo. I really love Gompi as a material. I don't love working with it. It's very finicky and difficult, but it makes really beautiful paper. And so actually for one of my projects, I kind of mixed Cozo and Gompi together. But I also like Cozo because I mentioned you can find it in the States. There's someone named Amy Richard in Florida. She actually harvests it. I guess it's a invasive species and it's growing everywhere where she lives. And so she and her husband just go out at dusk or whatever, and they gather a bunch of, they harvest it. And the way you do it is actually a very sustainable process. But anyway, it's this long process of gathering and steaming and stripping. And I just like that it's something that can be made, that's available in the States. And there's some other places too, at Iowa and Cleveland, some other places they're growing their own Cozo gardens. Thanks for that question. Hanji workshops in Korea. I'll just read the question in case people don't see the chat, but is it difficult to find places to learn how to make Hanji? Do you have a list of places that do workshops or internships? Is it important to know how to speak Korean? I would say if you, in Korea, there's these things called chehums, which is basically like get your feet wet, like do a 2-hour kind of intro. And they're very popular with kids because it's sort of like, they're kind of, I mean, they're not just for kids, but it's a very hands-on experience and way to kind of get an introduction to the craft. And they have these a lot in Korea. And so for that sort of experience, I would say you don't need to know how to speak Korean. And there are places like cultural centers, especially in Seoul, where you can find these kinds of workshops. I'd say if you want to do anything more in depth, it is pretty difficult. I'd say Korea is different from, let's say, Japan. It's not in terms of just, it feels less organized in terms of like the different craft communities, especially with paper. I'd say it would be really helpful to learn to know Korean because a lot of these Hanji workshops are in the countryside where they don't speak any English. My Korean's not great, and which is sort of like a plus and minus in terms of my own experience being in Korea. I can pass because obviously I look Korean and I know enough Korean, but in some ways I feel like more doors opened to me because of my heritage. And in other ways, I think if I looked differently, I would probably have more access, if that makes sense. And let's see, what was it like working with a Buddhist nun who makes paper? Well, Yeongdam Sunim was a very interesting person. And I was going to show you this book too. Maybe I'll hold it up right now, but she has, did I already show this to you? Did I already show this? I don't even remember. Okay. So she produced this book, which is actually really beautiful and it kind of tells her story. This is her making paper. And I mentioned she's a paper artist now, but she used to be a production paper maker. And I think that I think it's really unique to be a woman and because most of the production paper makers in Korea are men. It's very male dominated. Of course, women had other roles at the mills, but it's very rare to see a woman actually at the vat. But she was a very unique character. She was a Buddhist nun, but sort of had, there were a lot of things that she did and said that made me think like, oh, is she really a Buddhist nun? Like kind of just sort of her practices and things like that. So she was sort of like a liberal nun, I'll say. But it was an amazing experience. I think it was unique for her to have someone like me come all the way from the States to learn this craft. And so I think it was invigorating for her. And what else can I say about Yeongdam Sunim? I think if anyone goes to Korea at any point, she's still very active and she's sort of running, I think, a gallery on Jeju Island, actually. But let's see. But yeah, so my experience with her was very colorful, but thank you for that question. Do you have any advice for soon-to-be college graduates that want to continue making paper from home? What is it like managing your practice with being a mom? Do you have to get up super early? Do you include your children in the process? I could give like a whole talk on this alone. Um, well, for college graduates that want to continue making paper from home, I think it's really doable, especially if you have some space outdoors, like if you have a backyard. Even if you don't, if you have a kitchen with a sink and can set up like a folding table and put some plastic sheeting down, there's so many ways that are very accessible to get started with making paper. Um, and I mean, I personally didn't, I know a lot of people made paper when they were little kids. I had no exposure to paper until I was an adult. And so I think that, I mean, um, I I think it's such an accessible art form that a lot of times children can kind of latch onto it from an early age. But even as an adult, there's a lot of easy ways to process fibers and get very basic materials. The question about being a mom, do I have to get up super early? Yes. uh, I mean, I included some photos of my kids in the process, but to be honest, it's very rare. I don't know how. I know there's some artist moms who know how to integrate. Maybe my kids are still too little. They're 1 and 3. And so I think when they're older, I'm looking forward to sort of including them more in the process. And my hope is that they see me working and enjoying what I'm doing. And even though it takes time away from them, I think it's still really valuable and important. Thanks for that question. Has your creative practice changed during this time of social distancing? Has my creative practice changed? I'd say the most significant change for me is when I had kids. It hasn't, I don't think that the pandemic has changed much, except that it's just, harder to make work, to find time in the studio. My studio, as I said, it's my backyard and here, and this is my living room. There's no door, there's just a curtain, which doesn't really do anything. And so I'd say, the Bojaki pieces that I showed you, I really like those for a number of reasons, but since they are like patchwork, they can be picked up and put down and kind of worked on throughout a longer period of time. And so I really appreciate that. I think in general, I just gravitate towards more low tech and less reliance on like equipment and machinery, which kind of lends itself well to my current situation in life. Let's see. I will say though that I enjoy making paper in my backyard, and normally what I did last year, 2 years ago, is I invited a bunch of people to come out and see Korean paper making, which, I wasn't able to do that this year. Will we run out of Cozo, mulberry tree, or paper making materials soon in our future? So I think the question is about Cozo, mulberry tree, paper making materials. So yes, I think the issue is less, I don't think there's ever going to be a time where there's no more Cozo, because it's more the labor of harvesting it. So finding people, because that is the part that's very labor intensive and time consuming. The actual harvesting of the tree, it doesn't harm the tree. You actually cut it like not right at the root, but you leave a couple inches so that it grows back, and it's a sustainable process. And so it's not like where you have to cut down the whole tree and make, for Western style paper. It's a different process. So I think the issue is less about, having like the trees becoming extinct or anything like that. But it's really expensive. So a lot in Japan and in Korea, actually, a lot of the mills are sourcing their Cozo or their fiber from Thailand or China or places where it's just the labor there's more people and it's just cheaper, more affordable to access the fiber. And so it changes the quality of the paper. But yeah, to get paper that was 100% made in Korea, it's very expensive. Could one grow Cozo in California? I actually snuck a sapling back from Korea and it's growing in my backyard and it's huge. So I think that it's possible. I personally don't have land to, make a little farm or whatever, but I think it's possible. I mean, I don't know much about how the climate will affect, the finished sheets, but they say in Korea, because the climate is so harsh with the harsh cold winters, it makes the paper stronger. And that's like a metaphor for the Korean people. But yeah, I think that it's possible. I don't know of any places that are actively growing Cozo, but it is possible. Is it possible to make paper out of redwood trees? I don't know enough about redwood trees. All I know is that Cozo is a bast fiber, which has this inner woody core, and then you kind of take off the inner bark, and that's what's used for paper making. And I'm not sure about redwood trees. Maybe, I don't know if Jamie wants to jump in if he knows anything about that.
I don't totally know about that, but I think, that's a different, tree bark is a very different kind of fiber than a bast fiber, than these sort of woody shrubs. No, it's a good idea. I think trying to find, there's so many different things that we can make paper out of, so many different kinds of plants. But in general, I believe that tree fiber, actual wood fiber, takes a much harsher kind of chemical process to break it down in usable pulp.
I think you can make paper out of almost anything in nature. It's just a matter of how you would break it down into a pulp form and what kind of processing would be required, and the results would be very different, I think. But that's totally, I mean, speaking to the question about how to continue making paper, you can totally forage in your own backyard and find plants and different things to cook down and then make paper with and experiment.
And there's actually, for the people that are in the paper making class, there's a lot of really good resources in Helen's book about that. And Helen has a whole other book about paper making from plants that if anyone is interested, you should pick up. And I know someone in California who has experimented with making paper out of sea kelp and seaweed that is very interesting, and that's pretty sustainable.
Am I inspired by any contemporary artists, bookmakers, paper makers? Yes, I am. Let me think. I mean, I am, like I said, I'm very influenced by my time in Iowa. And so I think a lot of my approach and my inspiration comes from a lot of the work coming out of there in terms of the professors. I, uh, let's see, I'm very inspired by Amy Lee, who I mentioned before. She works a lot with Hanji and makes these vessels and does a lot with paper cording. And I'm also really inspired by textile artists, especially these days, and especially ones who are using paper as a textile. And I mentioned one of the articles in hand paper making kind of, or one of the issues of hand paper making specifically talks about paper as textile. And a lot of the artists in there were very inspiring to me.
Can I jump in real quick here just on that, Steph? For people that are interested, the library at CCA, and I don't totally know what access is like right now, but in the future, if you're interested, the library has hand paper making going back, I believe, to the 80s in their collection, bound in, I think, 5-year bindings. So it's a great resource.
It's a great resource, and they have each issue has a paper sample tipped in so that you can actually feel and handle the paper. And they always, or they often, it's very process oriented. So the articles often explain exactly how the paper was made and down to like the proportions and the, you know, so it's very much hands-on and sort of invites people to experiment and try different things out with paper.
Any other questions? So Steph, I'd really like to thank you again, and hopefully sometime we can do a visit to the papermaking program at CCA in person. If people don't have any other questions, it'd be really nice if everyone just turned off their mic, unmuted themselves for a minute and said thank you to Steph. So do that quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So
Thank you,
so
Steph.
fantastic. Great
Bye.
to see everyone. Really appreciate your talk, Steph.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much.
So any of you who want further information about any of this, if wherever you are, feel free to reach out to me, and you can find my contact through the CCA website. Before we log off real quick, people in my class, I would like to take like a 10-minute break and then come back just to this same Zoom for a few minutes for a check-in. And yeah, keep an eye out for Steph. She's got stuff going on. I'm assuming sometime in the future you'll be doing workshops at the Center for the Book again. So if you want to plug anything.
I mean, I'm teaching one on Sunday, but it's full. But I do, I will be teaching virtually through the Center for the Book indefinitely.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. My class, see you back here in about 10 minutes.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you still there, Steph? Those of you who are not in the papermaking class don't have to stick around. Only if you're in the papermaking class.